Nobody survived the stagecoach. Not really. They arrived, but something was left behind on the road. Every single fact you know is wrong. The movies cut 99% of what actually happened inside those coaches. The smell, the infections, the bodies nobody counted, the screaming you couldn't hear over the wheels. One of these facts is so disturbing that historians debated whether to include it in textbooks. We're starting with that one. 20 facts about Old West stagecoach travel that the history books softened, the movies erased, and the stage companies buried to protect their stock price. This is what it was really like to climb into one of those coaches. And by the end, you will never see a Western the same way again. Subscribe to our channel and give our videos some hype to help us out. Fact number 1, January 1859, Sierra Nevada. A man died somewhere on the overnight run to Placerville. Heart failure, cold, exhaustion, nobody knows exactly when. The other passengers were asleep, slumped, heads against the walls in the dark. The driver was focused on the road. The man sat dead in his seat for hours. In the dark, in the cold, shoulder to shoulder with other passengers who had no idea. The Sacramento Union reported the incident with 2 sentences. The company issued no statement. The route ran again the next morning. This was not considered a scandal. It was considered a Tuesday. Now ask yourself, how often did this happen and go completely unrecorded? The answer is buried in coroner's reports that stage companies successfully lobbied to keep out of newspapers. We'll get to what those reports actually found. But death wasn't even the worst thing that happened in those coaches at night. Fact number 2. Imagine the inside of a closed wooden box. 9 bodies. No ventilation, no stops. Wool soaked in days of sweat. Unwashed wounds. Tobacco spit pooling on the floorboards. And when someone had dysentery, which was constant, something that turned the entire cabin into a health emergency. 72 hours. That's how long some passengers sat in that box without getting out. The overnight run from Missouri to Denver. No stop, no air, no option. One overland passenger wrote in 1861 that he began breathing through his mouth by day 2. By day 3, even that stopped working. Mark Twain documented his own crossing in Roughing It. And Twain, a man who exaggerated nothing, wrote that the smell inside the coach was something he could not describe in language acceptable to a publisher. Twain couldn't write it down. You're imagining it now. This is what Old West stagecoach travel actually looked like. And that's still not the worst part. Fact number 3. Think about this carefully. No one screened passengers before boarding. No one took temperatures. No one asked if you were sick. Cholera, typhoid, smallpox, tuberculosis. A sick passenger climbed in, sat down and breathed for 3 days into a sealed box with 8 other people. By the time symptoms appeared, the coach was 400 miles away and the infected were scattered across 4 territories. Here's what no one talks about. Stage companies knew sick passengers were boarding. Ticket agents were instructed to complete the sale regardless. Refunds didn't exist. 3 or more major cholera outbreaks in the 1850s and 60s were traced directly to stagecoach travel patterns along the Butterfield and Central Overland routes by medical historians. Epidemics moved at exactly the same speed as the stage schedule because they were the same thing. What happened next was worse. Fact number 4. Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico. Fine alkaline dust, caustic, chemically abrasive dust ground to a talcum-like powder by centuries of wind. It poured through every crack in the coach walls like smoke. Passengers wrapped cloth across their faces. Within an hour, the cloth was black. The dust was already inside them. It packed into sinuses until they bled. It coated the back of the throat. It inflamed bronchial tissue. After 3 days, passengers coughed up dark grey matter. And after 5 days, some couldn't stop coughing at all. Army surgeons along the Butterfield route documented the respiratory damage in military passengers. Tissue destruction they had no diagnostic category for. One surgeon wrote that a 3-week stage passenger's lungs, examined post-mortem, resembled those of a coal miner with 30 years underground. 3 weeks on a stagecoach, 30 years in a coal mine, same damage. This is what travelling in the Wild West really felt like. But this is where it gets disturbing. Fact number 5. Mid-July, southern Arizona. The sun has been up for 11 hours. Inside the coach, 9 bodies, thin wooden walls, no ventilation. The temperature exceeded 110 degrees Fahrenheit. The air itself felt solid. Children went silent first. Not crying. Silent. That's the sign. Then the elderly. And then anyone already weakened by the road. There was no water stop for 40 miles. The driver would not stop early. He had a schedule. Records from the Butterfield Overland Mail document multiple passenger deaths from heat exhaustion on desert segments between 1858 and 1861. The company recorded them as natural causes. The route continued operating unchanged. What no account mentions. The dead passengers were sometimes left at the next relay station. The coach kept moving. Their belongings were held for 60 days, then auctioned. The company kept the fare. The company kept the fare. This was stagecoach travel in the 1800s. And that's still not the worst part. Fact number 6. There were no roads. There were tracks, wheel ruts baked into stone, canyon passages along cliff edges with 400-foot drops and no guardrails, and mountain crossings that washed out completely in rain and became ice sheets in winter. The Army Corps of Engineers surveyed sections of the Butterfield route in 1859 and issued a formal report recommending immediate rerouting on safety grounds. The stage company received the report, reviewed it, and made a calculated decision. Rerouting would cost more than the projected passenger mortality. They filed the report. The route ran as is for another decade. That document still exists in federal archives. It contains a handwritten margin note from a company officer that reads, "In full, cost prohibitive. Accept as is." The company ran a cost-benefit analysis on how many of you would die on the road. You were cheaper than rerouting. Fact number 7. No bridges. Most routes. The driver aimed the horses at the river and went in. They're sometimes chest deep on the horses. Sometimes a flash flood upstream had raised it 3 feet since morning, and nobody knew. When the coach tipped, and it tipped, passengers were inside a wooden box filling with fast-moving water. Doors swelled shut from the current, windows too narrow to squeeze through. The coach becoming a tomb in under 60 seconds. 11 or more documented stagecoach drowning deaths in California alone in the 1850s. Historians believe this is a fraction of actual deaths. Most remote crossings had no witnesses and no one who would write anything down. The Sacramento Daily Union eventually published a single editorial calling for regulated river crossings. The stage companies lobbied against the regulation. It failed. The crossings continued unchanged. People vanished. The coach kept running. No witnesses and no record. This is what Old West stagecoach travel did to people. What happened next was worse. Fact number 8. The official company term for a coach rolling at speed, tumbling down a hillside and killing or maiming everyone inside was upset. Not crash, not catastrophe. Upset. A 2,500-pound coach at full gallop. A rut at the wrong angle. The rig going over, sometimes 3-4 rotations. Passengers becoming projectiles inside a spinning wooden box. Luggage shattering against skulls. Wheels collapsing inward. The language was intentional. Upset appeared in insurance documents, company reports, and newspaper filings, because upset carried no legal liability. Crash did. The word choice was decided by lawyers, not drivers. The Overland Monthly estimated in 1869 that roughly 1 in 8 cross-country journeys involved a significant upset, enough to injure passengers, meaning this wasn't rare. It was scheduled into the risk of the ticket you bought. The word upset killed the conversation every time it appeared. Nobody investigated an upset. If you think this is bad, you haven't seen anything yet. What happened next is something most history books refuse to describe. We're only halfway through, and everything from this point forward gets darker. Fact number 9. Stage companies ran horses to death on a schedule. That's not a metaphor. Swapped every 10 to 15 miles, driven regardless of terrain, temperature, or condition. When a horse collapsed mid-gallop, Dad, the driver cut it loose without stopping, severing the traces so the dead animal wouldn't drag the rig over. Passengers felt the lurch. Some didn't know what it meant. Wells Fargo internal records from the 1860s show average horse lifespans on major routes under 3 years. A healthy working horse lives 20 or more. The company budgeted for annual replacement in the same line item as axle grease and lamp oil. There was no separate column for animal welfare. Here's the detail that stops most people. The horses knew. Travellers documented horses that trembled at the harness, refused the bit, showed every sign of traumatic stress, and were beaten into compliance anyway, because there was a schedule and the stage company had already received your fare. The horses had no word for upset. They just died. This is what travelling in the Wild West really felt like, but this is where it gets disturbing. Fact number 10. 30 hours without sleep. Eyes tracking a road he can barely see, reins cracked and bleeding in his hands, and a bottle he'd been working through since the last relay stop. This was normal. This was expected. Stage companies looked the other way because experienced drivers were nearly impossible to replace. They knew the routes, the dangerous curves, the exact ruts that would kill you at speed versus the ones you could ride through. You could not fire them. There was no one else. A confidential Wells Fargo internal memorandum from 1867, obtained by the Bancroft Library decades later, explicitly states that driver intoxication was a known and tolerated condition on most major routes, and that enforcement of sobriety policies would result in inability to maintain service schedules. The memo was marked for destruction. Someone kept it. That piece of paper proves the company consciously, deliberately decided that your life was worth less than the schedule. They wrote it down. This was stagecoach travel in the 1800s, and that's still not the worst part. Fact number 11. The man with the shotgun on top of the coach. His official job title, messenger. His actual function, understood by every outlaw, every company officer, and every man who took the job: absorb the first shot. Eliminate him fast, then deal with the driver. Standard road agent tactics, documented repeatedly in Pinkerton reports. Messengers knew this going in. They sat up there anyway. Here's what the companies never publicised. The pay differential between a shotgun messenger and a common labourer was approximately 30 cents per day. 30 cents. That was the dollar value placed on the additional mortality risk of the job most likely to get you killed in the American West. Wells Fargo records indicate the average working career of a shotgun messenger before death or permanent disability: under 4 years. The company maintained a pipeline of replacements. The recruitment ad did not mention the life expectancy. The seat was never empty long. Someone always needed 30 cents. What happened next was worse. Fact number 12. Think about the man beside you. Been riding since Kansas? Friendly, helpful, knows the route well. For 2 days he's been cataloguing your luggage, noting which bag is heaviest, which passenger seems wealthiest, memorising the coach's schedule for the next 200 miles. He got off at the last relay stop. You didn't see him leave, but 3 riders did, and they know exactly where you'll be at dawn. Pinkerton Agency investigative files from the 1870s document multiple Wells Fargo robbery networks with complicit employees at every level: ticket agents, relay station keepers, and in 2 confirmed cases, regular passengers paid on retainer to scout coaches for months at a time. One operative worked undetected for 14 months before being identified. The most chilling detail: Pinkerton investigators found that several of these scouts had been sitting next to passengers who later died in the robberies they facilitated. Some of them attended the victims' funerals. You couldn't know. That was the point. This is what Old West stagecoach travel really was. But this is where it gets disturbing. Fact number 13. No warning. No horseback silhouette on the ridge. The coach stopped. Rifles appeared at every window simultaneously. A voice from somewhere outside the darkness said, "Everything. Now." You gave it all. Immediately. Completely. And some of you still got shot. In roughly 15% of documented Wells Fargo robbery incidents between 1870 and 1884, passengers or crew were killed or gravely wounded even after full, immediate compliance with all demands. 1 in 6 compliant robberies ended in blood. Why? Some outlaws killed witnesses as policy. Some panicked at movement inside the coach and fired reflexively. Some simply had no reason not to. There was no law within 200 miles. There were no consequences. You were on a road in the dark and your life was worth nothing to the men outside. The gun wasn't a negotiating tool. Sometimes it was just the end of things. This was stagecoach travel in the 1800s, and that's still not the worst part. Fact number 14. The coach stops. It's dark. There is one structure, one man in the doorway, watching you come in. Stage companies staffed remote stations with whoever they could get. In hostile territory, 400 miles from the nearest sheriff. That meant men who were running from something. Criminal records, outstanding warrants, violence done elsewhere that hadn't caught up yet. Wells Fargo employment archives cross-referenced with criminal court records show that a statistically significant number of remote station keepers from the 1860s were later arrested for serious crimes. In multiple cases, travellers who disappeared in the vicinity of specific stations were never found. The investigations went nowhere. The stations kept running. The company's internal hiring standard for remote station positions, as documented in an 1863 operations manual, able-bodied, available and willing to remain. No criminal check, no references, no follow-up. Availability was the only criterion. You needed to sleep. You needed to eat. You had no choice but to trust this man. The company had never met him. What happened next was worse. Fact number 15. 15 minutes. Get out. Eat what you can. Salt beef stored in desert heat for weeks. Beans cooked in water from a source nobody had tested. Bread baked 3 days ago, now actively hosting visible mold. A coffee that multiple accounts describe as containing sediment of unknown origin. Sir Richard Burton, who had survived 30 years of global exploration, including the Arabian Peninsula and sub-Saharan Africa, documented his 1860 stage crossing and wrote specifically that relay station food was the single worst he had encountered anywhere on Earth. He described the coffee as something which in decent company could not be mentioned by name. There were no food safety regulations on stage routes, none. No inspection, no standards, no recourse. Passengers who got food poisoning at a relay station had no one to report it to, no way to seek compensation, and no option except to climb back into the coach and continue deteriorating for the next 200 miles. This is what travelling in the Wild West really felt like. But this is where it gets disturbing. Fact number 16. Bedbugs, fleas, lice, scabies mites, every cushion, every blanket, every station mattress, every surface that had touched a previous passenger. Within 24 hours of boarding, most passengers had been colonised. Within 48 hours, the bites were infected from scratching with dust-blackened hands. Within 72 hours, some passengers were running fevers from secondary bacterial infections. A physician who documented his own 1861 overland stage journey examined every fellow passenger upon arrival and wrote in his medical log, without exception, each displayed evidence of active infestation. 2 required lancing of infected tissue. 1 lost partial use of a finger to a bedbug bite that had progressed to necrosis in the coach. Necrosis in a stagecoach from a bedbug. The cushion that caused that man's injury had been on that coach for approximately 6 years. The company had never replaced it. It was cheaper not to. Cheaper not to. There it is again. This was stagecoach travel in the 1800s, and that's still not the worst part. Fact number 17. A woman alone, travelling west, to meet a husband, to find work, to start over. She sat in that box with 8 strangers, usually men, for days, with no legal protection in transit, no chaperone, no ability to leave, no company representative to report to, no law enforcement for hundreds of miles. Stage companies provided nothing. No female-only seating, no vetted companions, no policy, nothing. And diaries recovered from female passengers of the 1860s, several held in special collections at the Bancroft Library at UC Berkeley, describe incidents of harassment, intimidation, and assault during stagecoach journeys. In most accounts, other passengers did not intervene. Drivers, when later asked, said they were focused on the road. The most damning detail: at least 3 women's diaries document going to the company office on arrival to report what had happened. In each case, they were told the company had no jurisdiction over passenger conduct inside the coach. The company's legal position was that once your fare was collected, what happened to you in transit was not their responsibility. These women survived the journey carrying things that had no name in 1865. Their names are not on any monument in any Western town. What happened next was worse. Fact number 18. If you died on the coach, heat, disease, violence, the road, the driver had a protocol. At the next relay station, your body was removed. Your belongings were inventoried. A tag was written. The coach kept moving. Your luggage was held at the station for 60 days. If no one claimed it, it was auctioned. The proceeds went to the company to offset the cost of the delay. Wells Fargo operational guidelines from the early 1860s include a specific section on passenger attrition, the company's term for passenger deaths in transit. The section runs to 4 pages of protocol covering inventory, notification timelines, and disposition of unclaimed property. There is no section on prevention. There is no section on condolences. There is a detailed section on revenue recovery from abandoned baggage. The notification protocol required the company to send a letter to the passenger's last known address within 30 days. Not a telegram, a letter. Meaning families waited weeks, sometimes months, to learn their person had died in a box in the Nevada desert. The letter was 2 sentences, pre-printed, with a blank for the name. You were attrition. You were a pre-printed blank in a form letter. This is what Old West stagecoach travel really was. But this is where it gets disturbing. Fact number 19. The pamphlets that sold people on going west were works of fiction. Wide open skies, opportunity, a fresh start, land that was fertile and waiting, towns that were civilized and growing, a journey that was comfortable and well managed. None of it was real. The companies that printed those pamphlets knew it wasn't real. Advertising circulars from the Butterfield Overland Mail and the Central Overland California and Pikes Peak Express Company, examined by historians at the Smithsonian, describe the journey in language that contradicts nearly every operational document those same companies filed internally. The public-facing material was written by marketing staff who had never taken the route. The internal documents were written by people who had. The men who wrote the brochures and the men who wrote the operations manuals worked in the same building. They never shared documents. That separation was not accidental. You bought the brochure, you bought it based on the brochure. The brochure was a product. You were a product. This was stagecoach travel in the 1800s, and that's still not the worst part. Fact number 20. You made it. Weeks on the road. You're off the coach, alive. Look around you. The town has no sanitation infrastructure. The water source is the same one the horses use. The nearest physician is 4 days' ride away. The life expectancy in this territory is approximately 43 years. And it's dropping, because the same disease routes that brought you here are bringing something worse behind you. Historians estimate that somewhere between 30 and 40% of Eastern migrants who travelled west by stagecoach in the 1850s and 60s were dead within 5 years of arrival. Not from violence, from the same diseases, the same water quality, the same absence of medical care that the journey had already stripped their immune systems to survive. The US Census Bureau's analysis of frontier mortality data, compiled in the 1880s and largely suppressed from public circulation at the request of land development interests, found that the American West, during the stagecoach era, had mortality rates for new arrivals comparable to active war zones in Europe during the same period. You survived the coach. The land had more time, and you had already paid, in advance, non-refundable, for all of it. This is what they cut from every Western ever made. The dead man nobody noticed in his seat. The pre-printed notification letters. The cost-benefit analysis that decided your life was cheaper than rerouting. The scouts who attended the funerals of the passengers they helped kill. the women whose names were never written down, and the word upset that was chosen by lawyers so nobody could be sued. The stagecoach wasn't a symbol of freedom. It was a revenue-generating system in which human beings were the lowest priority variable. The companies knew the roads were deadly. They knew the drivers drank. They knew the stations were staffed by fugitives. They knew passengers were dying from disease spread by their own coaches. They ran the numbers. You came out cheaper than fixing any of it. And the people who climbed into those coaches anyway, with everything they owned, pointed at something they'd been sold in a pamphlet. They deserved better than a myth. What they actually endured was something else entirely. It was survival. And it was real. And now you know it.